Polyvictimization.org. Polyvictimization is the exposure to multiple types of violence or victimization, such as child abuse or neglect, childhood sexual abuse, bullying or cyberbullying, domestic violence, school violence, community and gun violence, medical trauma, natural disaster, or terrorism. There is a growing collection of research that shows that the impact of polyvictimization is more powerful than even multiple events of a single type of victimization. Polyvictimization by the numbers. According to a 2010 national sample that examined polyvictimization of children and youth, as many as 1 in 5 American children are polyvictims. Nearly 66% of the sample was exposed to more than one type of victimization. 30% experienced 5 or more types of victimization. A staggering 10% experienced 11 or more different forms of victimization. Assessment and treatment of polyvictims. Awareness about polyvictimization has many potential implications for those who work with juvenile victims and what they can do to identify and intervene on behalf of children who are exposed to multiple forms of violence. First, assess for more victimizations. Children need to be assessed for a broader range of victimizations. When children are identified as victims of sexual abuse or bullying, professionals who work with them need to find out what else is going on, as these children often experience other victimizations and adversities. Second, priority for polyvictims. Professionals who work with the children need to pay particular attention to polyvictims because of their vulnerability to mental health, behavioral, school performance, and other problems. These children can be identified in schools, in social welfare and mental health caseloads, and in the foster care and juvenile justice systems, and they warrant priority in victimization interventions. When child welfare and other professionals intervene on these children's behalf, they need to ensure that they are not minimizing polyvictims' victimization histories. For example, treating them simply as victims of child abuse when they are also being bullied, or simply as victims of bullying when they are also being sexually abused. In addition, as studies have shown that polyvictims, victims of violence who also bully others, have the worst outcomes and are more likely to have multiple victimizations. Educators and other child welfare professionals who work with the children who bully should recognize the need for more comprehensive assessments to identify them as potential polyvictims and for treatment that takes into account their multiple domains of victimization. Third, polyvictim interventions. Interventions need to be developed to encompass multiple victimizations. Therapies shouldn't just focus on, for example, sexual abuse alone, but should be multifaceted, addressing multiple types of victimizations, as many of the risk factors for one type of victimization are shared among multiple types of victimization. Therefore, prevention interventions that focus on addressing common underlying risk factors are likely to have the greatest benefit. Strategies for reducing stigma or traumatic reminders also need to be applied to the full range of victimization exposure. Fourth, treat underlying vulnerabilities. Professionals who conduct interventions with polyvictims must recognize that such children not only suffer from victimization trauma, but may also be caught in an overall environment or individual environmental interactive conditions that perpetuate victimization. Therefore, intervention professionals must assess for these conditions and develop strategies such as teaching, parenting, and guardianship skills to parents and other adult caregivers that address them. Fifth, broaden child protection. Awareness of the importance of polyvictimization suggests that the traditional child protective services, CPS, approach might benefit from some broadening of its capacities. An intervention system that helps children only in regard to threats from family members may be too narrow, although it is unrealistic to expand CPS to respond to reports of all forms of child victimization. Children within the current CPS system may benefit if child protection workers are trained to assess children for exposure to multiple forms of victimization, in the same way that police are trained to assess for multiple crimes. CPS systems could then design and implement service responses that are pertinent to the variety of threats children face. They have to be prepared to work with law enforcement, educators, and mental health professionals. 6. Interrupt onset sequences. Because polyvictimization is associated with so much distress, there should be a priority to figure out how to interrupt the pathways into this condition. Early intervention and primary prevention are needed, along with an awareness that dangerous and disrupted families, dangerous neighborhoods, and emotional problems can all be early warning indicators of current or future polyvictimization. Professionals who work with the children need to help build the supervision and the protection capacities of family members, legal guardians, caregivers, teachers, and other adults who may be in a position to intervene to help children and thus stop the onset of and progression toward polyvictimization. One strategy may be to target the transition to new schools, particularly elementary and high schools. It may be useful to sensitize teachers and other school staff to quickly identify children in these entering classes who may be victimized, to ensure that prevention and intervention approaches that address multiple forms of victimization experiences and focus on the prevention of perpetration are in place for children during these important transitional phases. The findings also suggest another strategy to encourage teachers and child welfare professionals to be more aware of younger children with emotional distress symptoms, in addition to whatever mental health interventions these children might receive to address their victimization experiences and associated symptoms. These professionals can take advantage of the opportunity to refer children and their families to preventive interventions that can address individual relationship and community factors that predict perpetration and prevent repeated or additional forms of victimization experiences from occurring. Another implication is that school staff and child welfare workers should pay particular attention when children report sexual victimization, including sexual harassment by peers. These events may signal broader victimization vulnerability, and responding adults may need to extend their focus beyond the specific sexual report to include an assessment of other forms of exposure to victimization. Polyvictimization icons and presentations, pathways from victimization to youth problem behaviors, the critical role of school engagement. School engagement has a powerful influence on youth development. Youth who fail in schools are at a significant risk for a host of subsequent psychosocial outcomes, including substance use, risky sexual behaviors, gun involvement, and increased contact with the juvenile justice authorities. Although school engagement is an important determinant of key developmental outcomes, few studies have adequately considered how polyvictimization may not only compromise school engagement but also negatively impact psychological functioning, lead to negative peer affiliations with guns, thereby subsequently increasing the risk for drug use and subsequent juvenile justice involvement. Polyvictimization, children's exposure to multiple types of violence, crime, and abuse. All too often, children are victims of violence, crime and abuse. This victimization may take the form of physical assault, child maltreatment, sexual abuse, or bullying. They may also witness such events in their homes, schools, and communities. Some children suffer several different kinds of such victimization, even over a relatively brief time span. These children and youth are at a particularly high risk for lasting physical, mental, and emotional harm. Violence, abuse, and crime exposure in a national sample of child and youth. Children and adolescents are exposed to more violence, abuse, and crime than are adults, an exposure that is responsible for considerable physical and mental health morbidity. This study gives precise dimensions of exposure to a wider range of specific forms of violence, abuse, and crime at different developmental stages, and demonstrates how some children and adolescents accumulate a very large number of these exposures. Developmental victimology, conceptualizing and intervening in crime, violence, and abuse in the lives of children. In this lecture, Dr. Flinkhorn discusses the broader range of crimes and victimizations children suffer from and discusses some of the reasons for this vulnerability. He also explains some of the barriers to combating and raising awareness about these conditions. He goes on to introduce this field of developmental victimology, its principles, as well as sharing the importance of polyvictimization. He then proposes activities that participants can use to curtail victimization and intervene on behalf of child and youth victims. Where there is hate, violence, polyvictimization, and developmental trauma in children's lives. In this National Child Traumatic Stress Network slide presentation, Dr. Julian Ford from the University of Connecticut discusses the numbers of polyvictims, the implications, developmental trauma disorder, and the recommendations for multi-system, multidisciplinary response.